Compassion is a quality of being in relationship to um, others, compassion with them in the intensity of their lives. It's an appreciation of their lives. It's the way we are usually using it. It has to do with the suffering of others and a kindliness and a gentleness and an empathy and a going outward to another person. But it's actually spiritually a more profound issue than that. I've been working for a long time with the phrase, out of emptiness arises compassion. Because most of the time when we think of compassion, we think of empathy. We think of suffering, seeing suffering, and then something happens in us and we want to do something about it. And we go out and we are concerned and feel for other people's suffering. We want to do something about it. But the kinds of compassion that one looks at from a spiritual point of view is the kind of compassion that is in which those qualities are balanced with the appreciation of the planes of reality that lie behind what is apparent or what is obvious. So compassion involves a certain kind of attention or a certain kind of a paradox. For example, when you respond from your human heart's point of view to another person's suffering, when you see them suffering, when you see a Guatemalan widow, or you see a family lost in crack, or you see any number of conditions that, well, the Chinese students, or what happened to the people around Chernobyl, or something like that, you experience incredible pain in your heart when your heart is open. I mean, many people just respond with their intellect. When they get in the presence of suffering, they can't handle it, so they pull back into their intellect and they deal with it intellectually. But if you keep your heart open, it hurts like hell. It really hurts, because especially when you started to appreciate that they're us, that they're not just them, when you can't intellectually push them away. But then there's another level of reality in which, and this is a much harder one for people to hear, in which there is an unfolding of karma for those individuals, in which their suffering is their route through to awakening, one way or another, long term though it may be. And in that sense, you look at the universe as a set of unfolding laws, and you see that there are no errors on that plane. You see the perfection of it. So that you're faced with the paradox that on one level of reality, the suffering stinks, and on the other level, it's perfect. And to me, compassion is the ability to embrace both of those simultaneously, so that you have an equanimity in you that comes from allowing it to be what it is, and at the same moment, your human heart, which is part of the way it is wanting to do something about it and reaching out to do the thing. But if you're only in your human heart, you burn out so fast, because there's much more suffering than you're ever going to be able to handle. And it's everywhere you look, there's going to be suffering. And your heart's just going to be, and everywhere you look, until finally you've got to put up defenses against it and turn it off. And the minute you turn off anything in the universe, you start to starve to death. When you go into your intellect to defend against suffering, you end up hungry, because you've closed down the energy flow between you and the rest of the universe. So the art is, how do you keep your heart open in hell, really? And part of you doing it is by the fact that you've cultivated existence in both planes. To cultivate just compassion in the sense of empathy and pain and emotional heart isn't enough. To cultivate emptiness, in which you say, oh, it doesn't matter, somebody falls and you say it's their karma, in that cold way, that isn't enough. It's that balance between those two things that is where the fullness of spiritual compassion arises. It's where you don't judge God just because the world is not understandable to you. I mean, when you see a child starving to death in a developing country, and it's very hard for you to philosophically come and say, well, that person's doing sadhana, or that person it's good for their spiritual growth. It's really hard to say because they seem, what is their life about that they took birth, or they're born addicted to crack, for example, in Seattle or something like that. I mean, it's very hard not to get angry, not to get angry at God and say, if I were God, I would have done it differently. The predicament is that you don't know why it is the way it is, and you're already judging it. So in the absence of your wisdom of understanding why it is, the stance you can take is, I don't know, but at some level I have connected to the universe and I appreciate the lawful nature of things, and that's a quality of trust, if you will, on another plane. And at the same moment, I see that on this plane there is suffering and my heart hurts and I got to do something about it. And that quality, when you've got those both riding, it's interesting because to get that higher quality, you've got to get out of the way a little bit. Your righteousness has to get out of the way. That kind of, just your human ego part of you has to get out of the way. And you'll find that when you get that balance working optimally, you're very effective in doing what can be done, realizing you can't take away all the world's suffering. And at the same moment, there is a way in which you see that you're just a part of the machine of healing and compassion, and there is all the other forces in the universe, and you're just another part of one of the forces. And you feel yourself as just being part of the rhythm of it all, rather than getting caught in the immediacy of that particular drama. And those kind of philosophical perspective stances keep feeding you, so they keep giving you equanimity in the presence of incredible suffering. There is a way in which our hearts are spontaneously compassionate. The quality of the heart is that it's constantly, my heart goes out to her. My heart goes out to him. The heart is constantly, would give away the whole scene. Take my car, take my money, take anything you need. Because the heart keeps merging with everything. The mind keeps saying, now cool it, wait a minute, watch out, because the mind is the protector of your separateness. And so the dialogue is also between the mind and the heart. And in a way, what we are talking about is, in order to survive as a separate entity, how much you have to close yourself down from your own spontaneous compassion. And what's interesting is the fear of suffering, the fear of the presence of suffering in the world, is the fear of your own heart. It's the fear that you will, and the fear is mind-generated, that I'll give away everything, and that I will have nothing, and then tomorrow it'll be horrible for me. That's what the mind is saying. The mind is saying, it's fine for Christ to talk about lilies in the field, but let's talk about Blue Cross Blue Shield. And the heart is saying, I can't give money for that. I mean, there's somebody that, and it's just going out all the time. And it's really interesting to see how you limit the heart's expression without closing it down, so that you end up feeling, because the heart is what feeds you. That spiritual heart. I'm not talking about the emotional heart. I'm talking about that intuitive flow that goes back and forth with the universe, which you can call love or presence or consciousness or whatever. But you begin to experience that when you do a compassionate act from this place of equanimity, and you're involved in that kind of relationship with the universe, you keep feeling fed by it. And I think most of you have had the experience where you serve somebody and people say, how wonderful of you to serve, and you end up saying, don't be silly, it was such grace for me to do it, and you mean it. And you mean it. Because it strengthens, and we don't realize that we have to exercise the compassionate heart. We can't just assume it's there because it gets closed down by the mind all the time. I mean, the pain of most people you look at who are living in their minds, whose hearts are not free, who are writing a check out of pity to keep the whole thing at a distance because they're frightened lest their heart open and drown them. And you think, what kind of a contract is that with the universe to live that way? So the quality of compassion has to do really with this spontaneous generosity that exists within us. And how do you nurture it and how do you give expression to it without... And most of the higher spiritual teachings say to seek emptiness and forget compassion is to go astray. To only be concerned with compassion and forget emptiness is to go astray. It's only the balance of the two of them in which you become free and really an effective part of the dance where everything is being fed in the process.
How do we put compassion into action?
Well, the simplest statement is you find somebody that needs you, and then you start to act to help them. But then you use the whole process as work on yourself until the helping is free of a helper and is a conscious action. So you use it as an exercise to make it truly a compassionate act. Okay? See, the most compassionate, what Buddha said was, I don't mean to quote him just because he's a good one to quote. He didn't corner the market on truth, but he saw some things very clearly. Now I'll come back. I'm going to stay in the concrete. The thing I would suggest to most people is you find something that needs help and you help it, and then you work on yourself to make it a conscious act. And, okay, what the Buddha said was that if you're going to relieve suffering, the root cause of the suffering is ignorance. And that ignorance has to do with the ignorance about your own separateness or your own entityness. And so when you feed somebody, if I feed you and I think I'm me and you're you and I'm feeding you, and that's the plane of reality I exist at, as I give you the food, I reinforce the sense in you that you are you and I am me. That is, if I focus on the giving of the act, I increase the dualism between us, the separateness between us, even as I'm doing something which is a kind act. I gave to her or I gave to him. And when you must know that feeling when somebody gives you something where they're busy being the person that's giving it, how you then are the person who's receiving it, and it separates people. There is another one where I'm giving you food, it's God's food. I'm just the instrument through which the food is getting from there to there, and it's not mine, and who's suffering and who isn't. And in a way, it is like one hand feeding the other. If I am living out of the illusion of separateness, if I have worked on myself enough to have extricated myself from the illusion of a separate entity, so I am feeling like I am one with you, then there is a transfer of energy between us in food or money or skills or whatever. It is the transfer of energy within an organism rather than between organisms. So rather than the act separating, the act brings together. So that you say, well, there are many levels at which you relieve suffering. You relieve suffering at one level by giving food. You relieve suffering at another level by giving the food in such a way that it draws people out of the pain of their own separateness. And that's part of the idea of respect of the people you're serving. And dignity and seeing them, like when Mira works in Guatemala, she sees these women as her sisters. She sees this as family now. And if you go from, those poor Guatemalans to, these are, after you get down a few times and you know each person personally, and you get to know and begin, it's family, it's us. And then when us is frightened of being killed, you're feeling that pain. And your acts are now no longer those rich people from America coming and doing good to us. It's the family sharing what it has with each other. It's a different quality of being. And the act feeds everybody. So what I'm saying is that you're driven to work on yourself all the time so that your acts of caring for other human beings aren't toxic. the powerful countries that give goods end up being hated by the people they give them to, just in the way they give them. So I would say you look around, like a lot of people that call me and they say, I really would like to help another person. I say, well, just go to the laundromat and look on the billboard, and you may find a sign that says, a blind woman needs somebody to read her mail, or somebody needs to have their kids taken to the zoo, or who knows what. Just look around. It doesn't matter where you plug into the system. The issue is where the quality of the behavior is when you plug into the system. And then at that point, you start to listen to your own unique skills, opportunities, availability, resources, etc. Some people can go off and go spend 6 months in Madurai helping Dr. V, and others have kids and they are already in a full, caring, compassionate trip, and they may just work with somebody in the local neighborhood. So there's no, you get going by getting going. But the getting going is not just doing the act. The getting going is the combination of doing the act and the exercise of using the act to see the way in which you're ripping off the act for your own psychodynamic needs, without putting yourself down for it, just appreciating the humanity of it. But also getting to the next level of it where you're just doing it because you're a part of the dance, and you're on the side of the angels. Just because the more conscious you are, as Gandhi said, when you surrender completely into God, you find yourself in the service of all that exists. It becomes your joy and recreation, and you never tire of it. And that's really, you can feel that in Dr. V when he's talking about his work in Aravind. That he works all day, all the time, his family works all day, all the time, and there is a joy about it, because you feel like you are an instrument of compassion being manifest on earth. And when you look around at the amount of suffering in the world, there's a tendency to say, oh, well, the hell with it. It's just so bad. Screw it. I can't do anything. So I'll just get what I can before it all explodes. That's a general, in the culture, there's a lot of that feeling. The other is to say, but flip this chart and look at the web of compassion that exists in the culture. Just look at it. Look at how many caring acts exist moment by moment, day by day, and realize that's a network of which we're all part. And as we keep feeding and nourishing that network, how that network feeds us and it keeps the balance in the world. And there is a balance in the world. It's just that the violent acts get press because the media doesn't know how to deal with compassion, because it's not an adrenaline hit for the most part. There's an organization called the Giraffes, which is a group that stick their necks out. And they collect people who stick their necks out for social good, and then they get them as radio spots and put them on radio spots on different radios. But it's hard to get them on. They come on public service announcements because they're not news. So I think it's quite simple. I think it's really quite simple. There are so many volunteer agencies. There's so many ways to join. Sometimes you join things, and then you've got to decide when you're going to look for a compassionate act, how close you want to get to the direct emotional intervention. Some people are most comfortable licking stamps back in the office, and some people only get the rush when they're holding the hand of somebody as they're dying. And you've got to examine that. And you've got to examine how much time you have available where you're not going to end up hating it because it is taking more than you're ready to give. You've got to know how to set limits. Because once you get into a service thing, it'll just suck you dry unless you know how to define limits.
Compassion literally means with passion. We talk about the passion of Christ, his suffering. And I think it's really interesting how the word passion has changed from suffering to what we think of as passion now. Ram Dass was talking there about how suffering stinks and is perfect at the same time. And yesterday I repeated a Rumi quote where he says, "Grief is the garden of compassion." So, suffering arises. Can we meet it with passion? Can we meet it with compassion? we've been talking about a developmental healing path where compassion, being a heart quality, really depends in a very direct and crucial way on being grounded and centered and having a clear awareness. When there isn't this clear awareness, very often then we relate to suffering either by pushing it away or by getting lost in it. Compassion fatigue, being overwhelmed by the suffering that's in the world. So, genuine compassion is based on an autonomous, centered, very alert, awake person being with what is going on there. And what is going on there includes, at the same time, the human suffering, the tragedy of people dying, of children being hungry, of people being shot for no reason, as well as the perfection of karma unfolding. Suffering is only suffering. Two people can experience the same exact event, and one will suffer and one will not suffer. For me, I think for a lot of people, working with suffering in the body is a very interesting and direct way to begin to see how automatically we pull back from suffering and from not feeling comfortable. Is it possible, even right now as we're sitting here, as you let your attention go through your body, some of you are sitting on the floor, some are sitting in bamboo chairs, which are quite attractive but not necessarily designed for long periods of sitting and listening to me talk about compassion. There is some discomfort in your body. And as I look around the room, I see people doing all these unconscious acts as a way of dealing with minor lack of comfort. So the medical community has had a very difficult time quantifying physical pain because they are conflating pain and fear of pain. Is it possible to use medication for pain, but to use meditation, awakeness, for fear of pain? For instance, if somebody is dying, it's really a shame for them to be overly medicated because the end of life is potentially a time for profound awakening of relating to loved ones in a way that maybe didn't happen before in your life. If we had time, I could tell you about how I helped both of my parents die, and some very wonderful things happened that had not happened in the previous many decades. But if they were overly medicated, if they were taking all these drugs so that they were not really present, then it would have been very difficult to be with them with that directness. So there are even studies. Dr. Stan Grof was funded by the National Institutes of Health to give psychedelics to people who were approaching death, who were certified to have terminal illness, and this was to see if they could help people be less afraid of dying. And what they found was that it was very successful, but what they found that surprised them was that after the study, many of these people experienced a significant reduction in the need for pain medication, even though the psychedelic being used has absolutely no pain-relieving property. So if I think that I'm 5 feet 8 inches tall and weigh 170 pounds, and there's X amount of pain bouncing around inside of me, that can be a really big problem. But if I have an experience that leads me to believe I'm the whole universe, and that same amount of pain is bouncing around inside of me, well, not such a big deal. Here we're talking about physical pain. The mind is much more manipulative and seductive. It's much more complicated. It's much harder to realize that even emotional pain is something that could be contextualized in the empty, spacious heart. Ram Dass was saying that compassion without wisdom, or wisdom without compassion, does really not work. Compassion without wisdom tends to be mushy and exhausting. Wisdom without compassion tends to be dry and brittle. We've been talking about compassion. What is wisdom? Wisdom is that the heart is selfless, spacious. There's really no solid person there, that everything is impermanent, that there is no permanent self, that suffering is caused by attachment. So, one thing I would suggest is beginning to deal with painful sensations in your body, and notice how the mind confuses pain and suffering. There are uncomfortable sensations that don't need to be really perceived as suffering, received as suffering. I believe Ram Dass told the story in the movie about his friend Ginny Pfeiffer, who was approaching death. She was writhing in pain, and she said that she had never felt better in her life. And I have been around several people who were dying in a great deal of physical pain, and yet they were not suffering. And in fact, dying with physical pain is often easier than dying without pain, because the pain begins to eject us from identification with the body. So that we have a body. This is not some Marin Ojai woo-woo thing that you're not the body. I mean, we do have a body. We do have a personality. But there is this other dimension. And in fact, once again, in the tape there, Ram Dass was talking about twofold beings. Can we hold these two truths at the same time? That there are so many stories in this room. There is a lot of suffering in this room. We can see it. We can see the uncried tears in each other's faces. And can we look around the room and see Maharaji shining through each set of eyeballs? Both are true at the same time. And that is wisdom. And without that wisdom, compassion becomes impossible. So, how many of you have done a practice called Tong Len, or taking and sending? Just a handful. So I would like to explain this practice. We'll do it together. And if I can pat myself on the back, even people who have done this before, I think might get a deeper understanding of the way it's going to be presented. Tong Len is a Tibetan Buddhist practice, Tonglen. It means taking and sending, or giving and receiving. And it is a practice that will help you cultivate compassion and loving kindness. Traditionally, it is taught as a practice for another person, because in Tibet, if you're a practitioner, you're probably not suffering too much. And I lived in Tibet for a little while. I walked around Mount Kailash, and I met a lot of Tibetan people who were incredibly happy people. They didn't have a lot of stuff. But you would be walking on this mountain path, and there would be an old woman coming from the other direction on the path, and she was so delighted to see me. When you're walking down the sidewalk in Ojai or Los Angeles or San Rafael, does that happen? Not too often, not too often. Okay. So, in Tonglen, as I said, it's often taught for the other person. In the West, it's often very useful to do Tonglen for yourself. And it can also be done for a group of people. In a way, one of the deepest healing practices I have found is being honest and centered and present enough to admit what your deepest pain is, where your deepest suffering is, and do Tonglen for that place. And in fact, on that back table are Living Dying Project newsletters, and my lead article is called Healing the Deepest Wound, which is really talking about what I'm going to say next. Gurdjieff, the rascally teacher, said that everybody has something called their chief characteristic, which is the place where you are so caught that you don't even know it, and it's the first thing everybody sees about you. So that's why we're in relationship, so that people can tell us, show us, reflect that place. Here's how we do the practice. And as I said, it can be done for somebody else. We could do Tonglen for victims of a shooting. We could do Tonglen for Donald Trump. We could do Tonglen for our friend Rado, who was in an automobile accident. We could do Tonglen for anybody. But just for the sake of me being able to talk about this with all the different possibilities, I'm going to explain it as doing Tonglen for part of yourself. And I'll explain it, and then we will do it together. There are 5 stages. The 4th stage is the main stage. Eventually, you can just go right to there, but it's useful to get the whole Megillah, whatever they call that thing. Okay. I think Meshuggah is a little different. Even though I'm not Jewish, this is not Meshuggah right here, right now. Okay. So, the first thing is you open your heart. It's called flashing on compassion. How can you open your heart to begin to do the practice? One of my Tibetan teachers said that he remembered a time when he was a young boy in Tibet, and he saw other boys stoning a puppy, and it ripped his heart open. I mentioned probably 2 days ago that there are 3 qualities of the open heart. Does anybody remember them?
Warm, open, and spacious.
Warm, open, and spacious, A+. Okay, so you could go to either of those 3 qualities. Let your heart be spacious. Breathe the sky into your heart. You could remember a time when your heart was really warm, when you were thinking about Maharaji, or you were connected to Hanuman or Maharaji, or you're watching your baby being born, or just so you're out in nature, the perfect piece of music. You open your heart. And then the second part of the practice, in a way the most crucial and the most difficult part, is you feel in a very direct, immediate way, a naked way, the suffering of this person. So here, you know the suffering because it's your own suffering. You actually feel it. If it were Donald Trump, you would feel what you imagine is his suffering. You don't just imagine his suffering, you feel what you imagine it to be. I mean, just think of feeling what you imagine he feels, okay? So you feel the suffering, and you begin to go into that. You deepen that feeling. You feel it deeply enough, finally, that compassion begins to arise. You begin to have a heartfelt wish that this part of you, or somebody else if you're doing that, is free from suffering. You go into your heart, you're in your heart, you're wishing that suffering end. And you go into the compassion deeply enough that now you go into stage 4, the main part of the practice, where you, the meditator, become willing to take the suffering of suffering you into you. So you're meditating, in front of you is suffering you, here is meditating you, and you're, as the meditator, willing to take that suffering into your own body. Or you're willing to take the suffering of Donald Trump into your own body. Now, when I first heard about this practice from Kalu Rinpoche, the Dalai Lama's meditation teacher, I thought, this is a practice only for codependent fools and masochists, and I do not want to do this. This is not for me. But after a year of hearing him talk about this, I decided I would try this. And I have done this now thousands of times, and I can say that I have never felt more toxic or heavy or dark at the end of taking in suffering, because the nature of the heart is truly boundless. Your heart can contain all the suffering in the universe. So, the fourth part of the practice, you're feeling compassion for this part of yourself. And as you breathe in, you imagine that the suffering is congealing. If you like to visualize, which I do not, I'm more of a feeling meditator than a visualizing meditator. But if you like to visualize, you can visualize the suffering congealing as hot, dark smoke. And as you breathe in, you take the suffering with compassion, focusing on the feeling of compassion into every pore of your body, into your heart of hearts. And as you breathe out, you send the antidote with loving kindness, with the optional visualization of cool white light. Focusing mostly on compassion as you're taking and breathing in, and loving kindness as you're sending and breathing out. You do this for a while. You can be driving down the street and see a homeless person and do 2 or 3 breaths. You have somebody that some part of yourself or somebody that you really care about. You can sit down and do this as a practice for 20 or 30 minutes. You can be going to bed at night and you decide that instead of counting sheep, you'll do Tonglen for everybody you know who is suffering, which it turns out is everybody you know, right? So I think of the people in my groups. I think of my son and his mother. I think of my friends who have cancer right now, and on, as a way of opening my heart as I'm going to sleep. So then there is an optional closing where this part of me that's suffering is joined by all the people in the world who are suffering in roughly approximately the same way. And I do the practice then for the collective as a way of taking the practice beyond a personal thing into a relationship with that quality of suffering itself. So I remember I was sitting with Kala Rinpoche, and a young woman said, "My friend has breast cancer, and I would like to do Tonglen for her. But I'm afraid if I do it, I will get cancer." And Kala Rinpoche said, "If you do it and you'll get cancer, you'll know that it worked." And he laughed. That was a Buddhist joke. Okay, what a joke, okay. You're not breathing in the cancer. In fact, you can't breathe in the cancer. You're breathing in the suffering. Now, you may notice that in the middle of the practice, I am not fixing the bad stuff. I'm not taking in the suffering and transmuting it to the loving antidote. I'm realizing that my heart is boundless. I'm not fixing anything. I'm taking in that which is most difficult and giving out freely that which is most precious. And because of that, this practice cuts at the root the place of your self-clinging. The place where we feel, I've got to protect myself, I've got to get enough to survive, I've got to make sure that I'm okay. We're cutting through that. We're saying, I'm willing to take the suffering that is out there and give freely my blessing, my love. So I'd like to do this practice now. And I'd like to begin by asking each of you to, as honestly as you can, See if you can find a place in you that has been suffering lately. Some place, some pattern that causes you to get caught, that you have a hard time feeling compassion for. Once again, if you can't find such a place, even though it's almost the end of the retreat, we will cheerfully refund all of your money. If you don't have that place, then the retreat has been so good already. Bye-bye. Okay. I don't sign the check, so I can say that without anything. Okay. So begin then by opening your heart. Spacious heart. Warm heart. Connected heart. Maybe feeling your connection with Maharaji, with Hanuman, with the Mother. Realizing that the boundless sky is in your chest. No boundary to the compassion that is your true nature. And imagine then sitting in front of you, suffering you. Look at her face, look at his face, and see the suffering on that face. How this part of you has been struggling. And meditating you begins to feel how suffering you has been caught, how suffering you has been suffering. How nakedly and directly, how vividly are you willing now, as an open-hearted meditator, are you willing to feel that quality of suffering? How it's in your body, how it's been affecting your relationships. Feel this more and more directly, being touched by what you've been going through. And begin to feel compassion then for this part of yourself. Compassion for suffering you. An increasing wish that he, she be free from suffering. You really, truly, in a heartfelt way, wish that this part of you be healed. The fact that it's appeared to you now is indicating it's ready to be healed. It's ready to be open to. Deeper, deeper compassion until now you are willing to take the suffering into your very body. You as the meditator. And as you breathe in, the suffering is congealing in the body of suffering you. It's coming out of that body through every pore of your body into your heart of hearts. And as you breathe out, you send the antidote with loving kindness. We breathe in with the optional visualization of hot, dark smoke, focusing on compassion. We breathe out, sending the antidote of strength or healing or love with loving kindness, with the optional visualization of cool white light. Taking with compassion, sending with loving kindness. And then imagine that this part of you is joined by all the other people in the world who are suffering in roughly the same way. You know what their suffering is like. It is so similar to your own. And you begin to feel their collective suffering. All these countless suffering faces in front of you. feeling their suffering, beginning to feel compassion for all of these beings. Compassion deepening to the point that you're willing to take all of the suffering into you. As you're doing it, you begin to notice how their faces are changing, taking with compassion, sending with loving kindness. Boundless heart, spacious heart, compassionate heart. Finally, bidding a loving farewell to all of these beings, coming back into your own heart, into your own practice, heart supported by strong belly, and back here into the room. When I train people to guide the dying, this is one of the main tools in the toolkit. It's a very powerful practice. As I say, it cuts through at the very root of our suffering. Anybody like to make any comments? Yeah, please. So, I mean, what comes up in my mind as you ask that question is, did Maharaji suffer after he became who he was? And he did a thing that always completely blew my mind, where he would send us away because he said, I'm getting attached to you. You have to get out of here because when you're here too much, then it hurts my heart. And yet, I'm not sure that was really suffering. I mean, I think we're playing with words there in a certain way. And one definition, I would think, of enlightenment is you are free from suffering. It doesn't mean that you're not moved by the suffering in the world. It doesn't mean that you don't feel the pain in your body and in the collective. But it means that you're not unconsciously reactive and suffering. So it brings up a couple of really interesting points that I wanted to make, because we only have 10 more minutes of compassion talk this weekend. One point is that it's really useful to be alert to how botheration arises. What bothers you? What disturbs your peace? What cuts through equanimity? And if, in fact, your life is an experiment in truth, then noticing those places is really good news. The other point is that compassion does not necessarily stop suffering. It makes it bearable and workable. And if we think that we're being compassionate to push suffering away, that is false compassion. It is really not true compassion. There's an attachment that's defiling the compassion, maybe just to a little bit, but still it is not pure compassion. So that, can we feel an open heart meeting suffering and realizing the suffering might stay? This is not being done to fix. It's being done as a practice to open and to heal, to become whole. And wholeness includes the suffering of the world. And Ramdas was talking before about wisdom and compassion. The nature of the heart is spaciousness. And we have an inherent fear of emptiness, which I think he also mentioned, or maybe I mentioned, I don't know, but fear of emptiness. That the ego structure keeps saying, wait a minute, what about me? You may notice that when you're meditating and everything feels really great, then you start thinking again. And I was at a long Vipassana retreat once, and I asked myself, I get in this place that's almost blissful. My mind is spacious. There's It's just, it's feels so harmonious and open. Why do these distracting thoughts keep coming back? And so I really paid very, very careful attention. I can't do this except at a long retreat. So I noticed there was this sequence of spacious, happy mind, joyful mind, thought, awareness of thought, spacious mind. But if I really paid attention, right before the thought was fear of death. Not like Dale, I'm afraid of death, but something in me was getting a little uncomfortable with not having thought for a while. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And the ego believes that. So that the ego wants to keep reifying itself. And it's got a really hard job because it doesn't exist. And it's got a doubly hard job because their spiritual job is to disidentify with it, right? So the ego's got major problems, but it keeps jumping in there and saying, hey, don't forget about me, I'm important. And the ego is a survival tool. It's a necessary tool. We're not trying to destroy it. We can't destroy it, but we don't have to identify with it. We are so much vaster than who we think we are. Maybe last night during one of the kirtans the last 2 nights, that the heart gets so large that the mind is just this tiny little speck. I would like to give myself a plug. And I run the Living Dying Project. There is a website, livingdying.org. There are some newsletters on the back table. I train people in the Bay Area to offer free of charge one-to-one support for people who might be approaching death. We have an online workshop that people from all around the world take that is the training that we offer in person in the Bay Area that has two-hour live streaming support sessions. And I work with people all around the world via Skype or FaceTime or telephone. So if you're interested in any of that, and we exist on donations pretty much, I found out, much to my surprise, that offering free of charge one-to-one support to dying people is not the world's greatest business model. Who knew, right? So, what haven't we said about compassion yet? So, in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, they talk about the process of letting the mind drop into the heart. And we often think of the mind as as problematic, that if I'm thinking, I'm not in my heart. It's very good training to learn to think with an open heart. The mind is not the enemy. The mind is a tool. And the ego mind is often just a way of filling up space, of getting distracted. Jack Kornfield tells the delightful story that he was, as a forest monk, he was out in the forest, where forest monks are, and doing walking meditation. And he said his mind was so quiet that he hadn't had a thought for 2 days. And out of nowhere came, use Ajax, boom, boom, the foaming cleanser, which was not really the ego. It was just something that had been shoved down there in childhood and came floating up out of the unconscious. But there is also the working mind, when you need to do your taxes, when you need to figure out what you're going to do today. You can do that with a compassionate, loving heart. It's not one or the other, right? But it takes training to use the heart, to use the mind and be in the heart at the same time. In one of Ram Dass's talks, maybe it's even in the movie, he was talking about compassion allows one to have a peaceful death. And in truth, what we're talking about here is compassion is the 4th chakra. And when we're dying, we die into enlightenment. one of the first things that happens after you die is you die into the light. The Tibetans say that this light is as bright as 1,000 suns. We've been talking for 3 days about compassion, working with suffering. There is another path, working with the light. And these are two parallel paths. In fact, working with the light is often a harder path because when suffering arises, there is an inherent motivation to do something about it. When the light arises, we say, oh, that's just the way it's supposed to be. I don't have to really do anything now. Can we cultivate that light that is as bright as 1,000 suns? Because that's what's going to happen when you die. And if that light is too bright, there goes another incarnation. Okay, so compassion allows the mind-body to begin to stabilize. Imagine how simple your life becomes when you're motivated by compassion. Not, do they like me? Am I getting enough? What's going to happen next? But what is the compassionate thing to do right now? And to that extent, with that mind becoming stable, then we can go into the throat chakra, the wisdom mind, the seventh chakra, and go into that place of wholeness, which is where we will be going when we die. Are you aware? What is, as you answer that question, can you hang out in that place of looking at awareness? As you watch awareness, the awareness of hearing me talk, are you more fixated on content and collecting and trying to fix and improve, or can you just be with the process of consciousness meeting experience itself? Consciousness does not die. Your personality, my personality, our bodies will die. So that all this compassion stuff, it's wonderful, but it's only a step to liberation. It's a step to one mind. It's a step to letting go of identification with separateness at all. We cannot go to that step. We cannot go to wholeness without going through compassion along the way. And I think that there is often a misunderstanding of compassion because we have compassion without the wisdom component, and it gets kind of mushy. Compassion requires empathy, but you can have empathy without compassion. You can have empathy for somebody else's suffering and be bothered by their suffering, get lost in their suffering. Compassion requires an empty heart. Compassion can be fierce. Compassion can be saying no. If you're a parent, you know about tough love, it is love. It's not other than love. When somebody is dying, I've had the experience again and again that people get mad at me when they're dying, and they're really not mad at me, they're mad at the medical community, they're mad at their doctor, they're mad at the insurance industry, they're mad at God, they're mad at their body. But there's Ramdev, there's Dale, who's a good, appropriate target, who's not going to be too overwhelmed by their anger. And so what is the compassionate thing to do? And sometimes I say, hey, just because you're dying doesn't mean you get a right to mess with me. Let's be honest here, you know. Let's really be as straight as we can. I like being around dying people because we can be so completely honest. We're not waiting for tomorrow. We're not trying to make nice because we're trying to get something to happen down the road. It's like, how alive are we willing to be in this moment right now? And that requires compassion, and compassion can be very fierce. Ram Dass has a movie called Fierce Grace, is it? And Maharaji was incredibly fierce. I mean, maybe you have an idea that being with Maharaji was really a lot of fun. It was the most difficult thing I've ever done. It was like living in a fire. And there were times of incredible joy and grace, and there were times of feeling completely worthless and just, I mean, I felt like I was dying of thirst, and I came to this ocean of nectar, and I had this cup that had holes in the bottom. And I'd take a cupful of nectar, and by the time I got it to my mouth, there was only one drop left. It's like, So Maharaji is Hanuman. Hanuman is Shiva. Shiva is the god of death. Here we are. Welcome. Okay.